Hello and welcome to the ASIS Economist Board. I'm John Nelson with Morris Nelson and Associates. I'm joined by Keith Prather and Chris Keel of Armada Corporate Intelligence. We're going to discuss our current economic environment and how it relates to industrial production. We've built a number of different models that use 18 to 20 different economic indices apiece that look back at data over 20 years to come up with the forecast that we do. So I do the math, and Chris and Keith try to make it make sense. So in this video, in the 7 related subsectors, we're going to dig into what is driving each one of the models and then relate it to the real world. So Chris, Keith, are you guys ready to go?
Let's do it.
All right. Let's go ahead and we'll look at our first one, the main portion of the ASIS, which is industrial production for manufacturing. And I'm going to pull up our main model here. And unfortunately, it's telling the same story as it has been for the last couple months. We have that, and you'll see this as we were talking before we got on video. You're going to see this repeated in model after model, this trend of a large dip. And there's no way putting shine on this. This is a large dip. A good 10, 15 points. And it's going to happen over the next several months, all the way out to about April of next year, and then starts a slow increase to start to a little bit of a recovery. The story that I have seen all over and over again that's been showing itself in the models has been the inventory story. We've been saying it month after month after month. It's inventories, inventories, inventories. And in this case, it's merchant wholesaler inventories that's causing the drop and then the subsequent rise on the back end. So I'm going to throw it out to you guys to pontificate and wax poetically on it.
Very good. Well, I've been observing the same thing, and we sort of discussed before we started this cast that it's going to be a little bit of a report from the front on my part. I've been speaking to a lot of manufacturing organizations over the last several months, and of course, they're dealing with this in a very real sense. And one of the things that they have been consistently saying, almost across the board, no matter what sector they're in, is that they had 2 artificial periods to deal with in the last couple of years. They had the supply chain chaos, which forced a lot of companies to start ordering and bringing in more inventory than they normally would. We saw this with the credit managers as well. So they were not trusting the supply chain. They were worried about the just-in-time, all of that stuff. So they started buying a lot more inventory than they actually needed. At the time, that was not seen as a particularly bad decision because demand was still fairly strong. But now that you've seen demand deterioration due in part to higher prices and inflation, they're sitting on a lot of inventory that they don't really need, don't know what to do with. They anticipate that that demand will start to come back when you get into second, third quarter of next year. But it's like they have to work through some of that inventory between now and then. There's also important considerations in terms of what this recession looks like over the last 20 years. This is so far not looking a lot like the 2008 recession, which was deeper and took a very long time to recover because it was a financial sector recession. This looks a little more like the recession we got in 2020, which was sharp and short. And it looks more like some of the other sharp, short recessions where you go down for a while, conditions alter, and then you start to get a rebound. What I'm concerned about, and what Keith and John and I have talked about, is that when we start to get this recovery, is it going to stay this slow, or will we start seeing maybe something that looks more like the upper bound, where it's a little bit sharper going in that direction? So, Keith, back to you in the studio.
And maybe John will go to the next slide, and that'll kind of help it a little bit. And I thought it was interesting, Chris, before we jumped on here, you said as we go through a lot of these models, you're going to see a curve that does look like a V-shaped recovery. I mean, it looks more like that traditional, solid dive and then kind of a snap back. I saw saw the other day, I know the Conference Board has put their new forecast out for GDP, and it looks like Q3, it looks like we're going to be really struggling to hit any kind of moderate growth, if you will, in Q3. They're projecting like 0.5%, maybe 0.8%. And they're forecasting a little bit of a decline in Q4, and a little bit of decline in Q1. And then again, a little slow growth rate in Q2. So we've got like 4 consecutive quarters here where it looks like growth is going to be fairly anemic, kind of flat, if you will. And I'm wondering if part of that is just this, what's happening in manufacturing is this overbuilding of inventory. Like we said, like John said, one of the major metrics that's pushing it down sharply is this really rapid rise in wholesale inventories, and then maybe trying to feed off those inventories for a little longer period of time till we get into sort of the second half of 23, and then you start to see the curve improve. I'd only throw
And
in
the other thing, the other thing is we talked about briefly is that even with the supply chain catching up, which it has largely, we're getting our pace back. There's still critical parts of it missing. I was at a manufacturing show this last weekend, and these guys make big commercial laundry equipment, and they said, look, 6 months ago we were missing, half the parts to do these things. Now we're missing maybe 6% of the parts, but you still cannot ship a machine that's missing 6% of its parts. So we're still in this situation where we can't really make money off the machine, but yet we're carrying all this inventory because we've been bringing in the stuff that we need. We're just not yet there. And so I think that continues to have an impact. And we've talked all along about the impact of high fuel prices and cascading into logistics. That hasn't gone away either.
Yeah. To your point, I mean, I heard a ridiculous. There was a CEO that manufactures Class 8 trucks, and he was just talking about what a ridiculous environment they've got, because what will happen is, exactly to your point, he said, they're down about like they may need like 6 parts to be able to finish a vehicle, but he said we have a almost fully assembled vehicle sitting out in the lot, and he said, we have a little drayage truck or whatever that go out and hook it up, pull it onto the assembly line, and they'll put a part on it and then pull it right back into the parking lot and wait till they get another one in. And then sometimes, if it's a chip or something, they can send a worker out there to the unit itself, plug it in out in literally out in the parking lot. But he said it's amazing how many times those vehicles are having to come back and forth to the assembly line right now to be able to get a finished product, to be able to deliver it.
Exactly.
But they got to carry all that in their inventory until they can actually deliver it.
Yep.
So this is what the year over year looks like, and you can see the projection for the months going forward in there in the dashed line, in red. It's kind of an ugly story.
It very definitely is. I mean, I think we're in that transition period. We went through something like that again in 2008, where things got fixed kind of in 2008 as far as the banks were concerned. We had the carnage and we had all the banks going out and we had the bailout, but it wasn't like the next day things were better. I mean, it took 2 or 3 or 4 years for that to kind of adjust, the banks that were going to get absorbed, et cetera. So we're kind of going through that now, where the manufacturers, again, the conversation I hear is we're almost ready. But now we're also running into demand deterioration because the companies, inflation, we were talking earlier, that the biggest competitor that most manufacturers have is themselves. Their old machines competing against their new machines. So a company is like, well, I don't really need to replace you because it still works just fine. It's not the latest and the greatest and the brightest, but it'll do. And in this innovation environment, maybe I wait a year or so. We did a survey with one of the groups I work with, and their capital investment decisions, they haven't canceled them. There have been very few that have said we're not going to do CapEx. They've delayed them. They're all putting out saying we're still going to do it, but it's now 3 or 4 quarters away instead of thinking we're going to do it now.
Wow.
Hearing the same
All right,
thing.
so now with IP Man, IP Man, of course, being the overview, we also take a look in the upfront piece here at about our 2 main commodities, and I want to take a look at primary metal. again, you're looking at a curve that looks a lot like the overall IP man curve. And Keith or Chris, you want to talk about this at all, or?
Well, I think it's the same story, and I keep kind of not that I'm a naturally optimistic person, which I'm generally not, but I look at the upper bound and I said if we hit the upper estimate, we're back in solid growth. The chances of hitting that about as good as hitting the lower estimate where it looks really even more awful than it is. But you're seeing that same kind of behavior with again, the laundry guys are on my mind because I just met with them. They've loaded up with stainless steel because they know they need this, but they're not yet using it because they're waiting for these other parts. So they have been buying this stainless steel to be ready for production, don't yet have the demand. And I think what we're seeing with a lot of the metals is that people bought a lot, they put in inventory, the producers have seen less demand, so they're cutting back to a certain degree. But in the great scheme of things, we're also getting that recovery, not a robust one exactly, but not awful either.
So unless you think we need to take, I'll flip through these next couple charts. You're looking at the long range and primary metal. I don't think that's revealing anything different than, or
No,
really
it's
adding much
looking
more to it.
very 2020-ish.
And you got your year over year, but let's take a look at fabricated metal, and fabricated metal once again telling a similar story.
Yep, and I think fab metal is a little more sensitive because this is, as opposed to the primary metal, this is kind of the finishing side of all this. And the fab metal people are going to be a lot more sensitive to the consumer market, a lot more sensitive to what amounts to discretionary spend. They are highly dependent on people making the decision to replace appliances and do those kinds of buying, and the consumer right now is putting that on hold, just like the business community is putting on their capital spending on hold. It's just they want it at some point, but and we could go into waxing philosophical, but back in the day, manufacturing had a nice little gig because everything was basically made to wear out quickly. And it's not now. It's designed to last a very long time, and companies end up competing against their older versions. I mean, you just think of automotive, the average age of the car now has hit 13 years. And anybody who grew up in the 50s and 60s, like, holy cow, man, you got more than 13 weeks? That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, long range. Now, the one thing in both this and primary metal, the long range trend is kind of this general sloping down. Is there anything you want to mention? Either you want to mention about that?
The only sort of, and it's no big surprise, and it's been hitting this sector a long time, the number one competitor for fabricated metal is plastic. And the more that you see plastic use creeping into areas that used to be exclusively fab metal, and it's accelerating. I mean, the two big long-term threats, ceramics and plastic. I mean, that there are actually now airplanes that are being developed that are made of ceramics and perform better than an aluminum airplane. So that's where you're getting this long-term erosion where people are just finding other things to use other than fab metal.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that completes our look at the overall industrial production environment. And so Keith and Chris, unless you have any closing comments, we will wrap this one up and then move on to our individual sector reports.
Sounds good.
And
All right. Take care.
Thanks.